Hello, my name is Monica Manginsai, and I will be doing the Chicken Wing Lab for Human Anatomy and Physiology 1 for Dr. Judith Davis's class at FSCJ. The upper limb in humans. 30 separate bones form the bony framework of each upper limb. Each of these bones may be described regionally as a bone of the arm, forearm, or hand. Keep in mind that anatomically the arm is only the part of the upper limb between the shoulder and the elbow. Arm. The humerus, the sole bone of the arm, is a typical long bone, the largest long bone of the upper limb. It articulates with the scapula at the shoulder and with the radius and ulna forearm bones at the elbow. At the proximal end of the humerus, it is smooth, hemispherical head which fits into the glenoid cavity of the scapula in the manner that allows the arm to hang freely at one side. Immediately inferior to the head is a slight constriction, the anatomical neck. Just inferior to this are the lateral, greater tubercle, and the more medial, lesser tubercle, separated by the intertubercular sulcus and bicipital groove. These tubercles are sites of attachment of the rotator cuff muscles. The intertubercular sulcus guides a tendon of the biceps muscle of the arm to its attachment point at the rim of the glenoid cavity, the supraglenoid tubercle. Just distal to the tubercles is the surgical neck, so named because it is the most frequently fractured part of the humerus. About midway down the shaft, on its lateral side, is the V-shaped deltoid tuberosity, the roughened attachment site for the deltoid muscle of the shoulder. Nearby, the radial groove runs obliquely down the posterior aspect of the shaft, marking the course of the radial nerve, an important nerve of the upper limb. At the distal end of the humerus are two condyles, a medial trochlea pulley, which looks like an hourglass tipped on its side, and the bilateral ball-like capitulum. These condyles articulate with the ulna and the radius, respectively. The condyle pair is flanked by the medial and lateral epicondyles, muscle attachment sites. Directly above these epicondyles are the medial and lateral supracondylar ridges. The ulnar nerve, which runs behind the medial epicondyle, is responsible for the painful tingling sensation you experience when you hit your funny bone. Superior to the trochlea on the anterior surface is the coronoid fossa. On the posterior surface is the deeper olecranon fossa. These two depressions allow the corresponding processes of the ulna to move freely when the elbow is flexed and extended. A small radial fossa lateral to the coronoid fossa receives the head of the radius when the elbow is flexed. Forearm. Two parallel long bones, the radius and ulna, form the skeleton of the forearm, or antebrachium. Unless a person's forearm muscles are very bulky, these bones are easily palpated along their entire length. Their proximal ends articulate with the humerus. Their distal ends form joints with the bones of the wrist. The radius and ulna articulate with each other both proximally and distally at small radio-ulnar joints, and they are connected along their entire length by a flat, flexible ligament, the interosseous membrane. Interosseous is between the bones. In the anatomical position, the radius lies laterally on the thumb side and the ulna medially. However, when you rotate your forearm so the palm faces posterior, a movement called pronation, the distal end of the radius crosses over the ulna and the two bones form an X. The ulna, elbow, is slightly longer than the radius. It has the main responsibilities for forming the elbow joint with the humerus. Its proximal end looks like an adjustable end of a monkey wrench. It bears two prominent processes, the olecranian, elbow, and the coronoid process, separated by a deep concavity, the trochlear notch. Together, these two processes grip the trochlea of the humerus, forming a hinge joint that allows the forearm to be bent upon the arm, flexed, then straightened again, extended. When the forearm is fully extended, the olecranian locks into the olecranian fossa, keeping the forearm from hyperextending or moving posteriorly behind the elbow joint. The posterior olecranon forms the angle of the elbow when the forearm is flexed and is the bony part that rests on the table when you lean on your elbows. On the lateral side of the coronoid process is a small depression, the radial notch, where the ulna articulates with the head of the radius. Distally, the ulnar shaft narrows and ends in a knob-like head. Medial to the head is the ulnar styloid process, from which a ligament runs to the wrist. The ulnar head is separated from the bones of the wrist by a disc of fibrocartilage and plays little or no role in hand movements. Radius. The radius rod is thin at its proximal end and wide distally, the opposition of the ulna. The head of the radius is shaped somewhat like the head of a nail. The superior surface of this head is concave and it articulates with the capitulum of the humerus. Medially, the head articulates with the radial notch of the ulna. Just inferior to the head is the rough radial tuberosity, which anchors the biceps muscle of the arm. Distally, where the radius is expanded, it has a medial ulnar notch, which articulates with the ulna, and a lateral radial styloid process, and anchoring site for ligaments that run to the wrist. Between these two markings, the radius is concave where it articulates with the carpal bones of the wrist. The ulna contributes more heavily to the elbow joint, and the radius is the forearm bone contributing to the wrist joint. When the radius moves, the hand moves with it. Hand. The skeleton of the hand includes the bones of the carpus, wrist, the bones of the metacarpus, palm, and the phalanges, bones of the fingers. Carpus, wrist. A wrist watch is actually worn on the distal forearm over the lower ends of the radius and ulna, not on the wrist at all. The true wrist, or carpus, is the proximal part of the structure we generally call our hand. The carpus consists of 8 marble-sized short bones, or carpals, closely united by ligaments. Because gliding movements occur between the bones, the carpus as a whole is quite flexible. The carpals are arranged in 2 irregular rows of 4 bones each. In the proximal row, lateral to medial, are the scaphoid, boat-shaped, lunate, moon-like, triquetrum, triangular, and pisiform, pea-shaped. Of these, all but the pisiform participate in forming the wrist joint. The carpals of the distal row, lateral to medial, are the trapezium, little table, trapezoid, 4-sided, capitate, head-shaped, and hamate, hooked. There are numerous memory jogging phrases to help you recall the carpals in the order given above. If you don't have one, try Sally left the party to take Cindy home. As with all such memory jogs, the first letter of each word is the first letter of the term you need to remember. Metacarpus, palm. 5 metacarpals radiate from the wrist-like spokes to form the metacarpus, or palm, of the hand, meta, beyond. These small long bones are not named, but instead are numbered I to V from thumb to little finger. The bases of the metacarpals articulate with the carpals proximally and each other medially and laterally. Their bulbous heads articulate with the proximal phalanges of the fingers. When you clench your fist, the heads of the metacarpals become prominent as your knuckles. Metacarpal I, or 1, associated with the thumb, is the shortest and most mobile. It occupies a more anterior position than the other metacarpals. Consequently, the joint between metacarpal 1 and the trapezium is a unique saddle joint that allows opposition, the action of touching your thumb to the tips of your other fingers. Phalanges, fingers. The fingers or digits of the upper limb are numbered 1 to 5, beginning with the thumb or pollex. In most people, the third finger is the longest. Each hand contains 14 miniature long bones called phalanges. Except for the thumb, each finger has 3 phalanges, distal, medial, and proximal. The thumb has no middle phalanx. Phalanx, closely knit row of soldiers, is the singular term for phalanges. Bones. And we move on to the joints. We have the elbow joint, which is the ulna and radius articulating with the humerus, specifically the ulna. It is a synovial hinge type joint. And you have the proximal radio-ulnar joint. It's the radius and the ulna articulating together, and it is a synovial pivot joint. Movements allowed by synovial joints. Every skeletal muscle of the body is attached to bone or other connective tissue structures at no fewer than 2 points. The muscle's origin is attached to the immovable or less movable bone. Its other end, the insertion, is attached to the movable bone. Body movement occurs when muscles contract across joints and their insertion moves toward their origin. The movements can be described in directional terms relative to the lines or axes around which the body parts move and the planes of space along which the movement occurs. That is, along the transverse, frontal, or sagittal plane. Excuse me. Angular movements increase or decrease the angle between 2 bones. These movements may occur in any plane of the body, including flexion, extension, hyperextension, abduction, adduction, or circumduction. Flexion is a bending movement, usually along the sagittal plane, that decreases the angle of the joint and brings the articulating bone closer together. Examples include bending the head forward on the chest and bending the body trunk or the knee from straight to angled position. As a less obvious example, the arm is flexed at the shoulder when the arm is lifted in an anterior direction. Extension is the reverse of flexion and occurs at the same joints. It involves movement along the sagittal plane that increases the angle between the articulating bones and typically straightens a flexed limb or body part. Examples include straightening a flexed neck, body trunk, elbow, or knee. Continuing such movements beyond the anatomical position is called hyperextension, literally superextension. Abduction, moving away, is the movement of a limb away from the midline or medial plane of the body along the frontal plane. Raising the arm or thigh laterally is an example of abduction. For the fingers or toes, abduction means spreading them apart. In this case, midline is the longest digit, the third finger or second toe. Notice, however, that lateral bending of the trunk away from the body midline in the frontal plane is called lateral flexion, not abduction. Adduction, moving toward, is the opposite of abduction, so it is the moving of a limb toward the body midline, or in the case of the digits, toward the midline of the hand or foot. Circumduction is moving a limb so that it describes a cone or space. Circum, around, ducto, to draw. The distal end of the limb moves in a circle while the point of the cone, the shoulder or hip joint, is more or less stationary. A pitcher winding up to throw a ball is actually circumducting his or her pitching arm, because circumduction consists of flexion, abduction, extension, and adduction performed in succession. It is the quickest way to exercise the many muscles that move the hip and shoulder, ball, and socket joints. Rotation is the turning of a bone around on its own axis. It is the only movement allowed between the first two cervical vertebrae and is common at the hip and shoulder joints. Rotation may be directed toward the midline or away from it. For example, in medial rotation of the thigh, the femur's anterior surface moves toward the medial plane of the body. Lateral rotation is the opposite movement. Special movements. Certain movements do not fit in any of the above categories and occur at only a few joints. Supination and pronation. The terms supination, turning backward, and pronation, turning forward, refer to the movements of the radius around the ulna. Rotating the forearm laterally so that the palm faces anteriorly or superiorly is supination. In the anatomical position, the hand is supinated and the radius and ulna are parallel. In pronation, the forearm rotates medially and the palm faces posteriorly or inferiorly. Pronation moves the distal end of the radius across the ulna so the two bones form an X. This forearm's position when we are standing in a relaxed manner. Pronation is a much weaker movement than supination. A trick to help you keep these terms straight: a pro basketball player pronates his or her forearm to dribble the ball. Types of connective tissues. As noted, all classes of connective tissue consist of living cells surrounded by a matrix. As mentioned earlier, mature connective tissue arises from a common embryonic tissue called mesenchyme. Mesenchyme has a fluid ground substance containing fine sparse fibers and star-shaped mesenchymal cells. It arises during the early weeks of embryonic development and eventually differentiates or specializes into all other connective tissue cells. However, some mesenchymal cells remain to provide a source of new cells in mature connective tissues. Connective tissue proper, loose connective tissues. Connective tissue proper has two subclasses: loose connective tissues, areolar, adipose, and reticular, and dense connective tissue, dense regular, dense irregular, and elastic. Except for bone, cartilage, and blood, all mature connective tissues are connective tissue proper. Areolar connective tissue. The functions of areolar connective tissue supporting and binding other tissues, the job of the fibers, holding body fluids, the ground substance's role, defending against infection via the activity of white blood cells and macrophages, storing nutrients as fat in fat cells. Connective tissue proper, dense connective tissues. The three varieties of dense connective tissue are dense regular, dense irregular, and elastic. Since all three have fibers as their prominent element, dense connective tissues are often called fibrous connective tissues. Dense regular connective tissue contains closely packed bundles of collagen fibers running in the same direction parallel to the direction of pull. This arrangement results in white, flexible structures with great resistance to tension or pulling forces where the tension is exerted in a single direction. Crowded between the collagen fibers and rows of fibroblasts that continuously manufacture the fibers and scant ground substance. Collagen fibers are slightly wavy. This allows the tissue to stretch a little, but once the fibers straighten out, there is no further give to the tissue. Unlike our model areolar tissue, connective tissue, this tissue has few cells other than fibroblasts and is poorly vascularized. With its enormous tensile strength, dense regular connective tissue forms tendons, which are cords that attach muscles to bones. Flat sheet-like tendons called aponeurosis that attach muscles to other muscles or to bones, and the ligaments that bind bones together at joints. Ligaments contain more elastic fibers than tendons and are slightly more stretchy. Dense regular connective tissue also forms fascia, a bond, a fibrous membrane that wraps around muscles, groups of muscles, blood vessels, and nerves, binding them together like plastic sandwich wrap. Let's see. Ligaments. Reinforcing ligaments. Synovial joints are reinforced and strengthened by a number of band-like ligaments. Most often, these are capsular ligaments, which are thickened parts of the fibrous layer. In other cases, they remain distinct and are found outside the capsule as extracapsular ligaments, or deep to it as intracapsular ligaments. Some intracapsular ligaments are covered with synovial membrane. They do not actually lie within the joint cavity. Right. First. It's on. Picture. Okay, so So this, excuse me, appears to be the left wing, which means that this would be the anterior. This posterior. This would be lateral. And this would be medial. Okay. Elbow. Well, first, I guess I need to. Okay. So this bone in here is going to be humerus. Okay. Not there yet. Okay. Get pictures of the radius, ulna, carpals, metacarpals, phalanges. Okay. Position, elbow, locate structures. Okay. The elbow, structures that move it. Right. So here, and muscle there. Okay. So when a muscle is flexed, arm is straight. When the muscle is extended, straight. Part about flexion and extension. Here we go. Flexion, bending movement. That's right. decreases the angle of the joint and brings the articulating bones closer together. So this one here is got to be the extensor muscles. So pull it, straightens up. This has to be the flexor muscle. Pull this close together. Okay. Flexor, tendon, tendon. Right part there. Okay, so origin would be back there, and then this would be the insertion. Okay, the extensor tendon is that one. Extracapsular ligaments. Dense, regular connective tissue. And then Tendons. Okay, with its enormous tensile strength, dense regular connective tissue forms tendons, which are cords that attach muscles to bones. And ligaments contain more elastic fibers than tendons and are slightly more stretchy. Dense regular connective tissue also forms fascia, fibrous membrane. So what we're looking for, extracapsular ligaments. I read about reinforcing. Here we go. Reinforcing ligaments. Synovial joints are reinforcing and strengthened by a number of band-like ligaments. Most often, these are capsular ligaments, which are thickened parts of the fibrous layer. In other cases, they remain distinct and are found outside the capsule. Extracapsular ligaments, or deep to it intracapsular ligaments. Some intracapsular ligaments are covered in synovial membrane. So, the extracapsular ligaments are caps ligament. That's going to be find a ligament. No. That's the tendon. The ligament. That's the ligament. Across the bone. There we go. Insertion at the distal end. There. And there. Distal. Okay. Next feel different. That cut pretty easy. Because the ligaments inside, in between the two bones here. Ligaments seem harder to cut. Yeah. Scan off of here. You can see these bones. Get to them. That's pretty tough. Doesn't give. Hmm. Ah, yes. The radius and the ulna. So, the one that makes the elbow. The ulna. Interior. Lateral. Medial. Distal.